Hello and welcome to another episode of Rebel Rogue, where today I will be showing you some more advanced layering techniques. Rebel Rogue. If you've seen my previous video on layering, then you will have seen the basic technique that you use to build up colour. I didn't show you exactly how, say, Duncan Rhodes would do it, but I've showed you how I go about doing it. In this video I will be showing you 3 new techniques, or different techniques you can use to enhance the look of your model. The first technique is a dramatic layer. For this I will be using a high elf warrior from Middle Earth that has been slightly converted, and I will be painting the cloak red. To go about doing this though, I will be keeping black in my shadow and just putting a layer on with red rather than a full base coat. I will then build it up with a thinner layer of orange and a final layer of yellow. If you were doing this on another model that didn't include red, you could use white as your final highlight, but remember that white will make red more pink and it will desaturate quite a lot of other colours. So, taking Mephiston Red as my colour for my cloak and taking my Raphael, I'm going to apply this as a layer on top of the cloak like so, and leaving black in the recesses like so, keeping Mephiston Red quite thin as I would when layering normally. There we are. Not finished, but I'll finish it off and see you for the next step. Now that the Mephiston Red is pretty much dry, you can see the effect this has on the model. If you want to, and I would advise it, you could do multiple thin layers onto this cloak, but for speed and ease of showing this technique, I'm just going to do the one. The next colour is a Vallejo's Bright Orange. It doesn't really matter what colour, I'm just demonstrating a technique. I'm going to take this bright orange and I'm going to apply it to the edges of the cloak, more as a highlight than a layer. If you've seen my video on highlighting, you'll sort of get what I'm on about. So I'm going to apply it more towards the upper edges, but still coming down like so onto the cloak like so, onto the cloak here, and onto the middle there. This orange is bringing a bit of sort of heat and fire into this cloak, so it does look very fiery. And it does look a bit orange, probably a bit too orange, but there we are. I could probably tidy up these layers later. And there we are. Quite fiery. And then once that's dry, I can apply a final highlight with Vallejo's Deep Yellow. This will be applied right at the top edges and on the finest edges of the cloak. This I'll come back after I finish that and I'll show you the end result. And here you can see the finished effect of dramatic layering. You can see it is quite bright, quite stark, and the yellow is probably a bit overpowering. I could have probably chosen a brighter red, but I think overall I quite like the effect. It's very, very dramatic and very high contrast. Now we can move on to the second technique. The second advanced layering technique involves mixing of colours and very, very subtle. It's very, very subtle. Quite simply, you would basically blend from one colour to another. You could of course use wet blending, but in this case it's because we're using layering. I'm going to show you how you would do it with only layering rather than going into wet blending and feathering and all that other stuff. So let's get cracking. The cloak on this high elf is going to be painted with a blend from Prussian blue to from dark Prussian blue to Prussian blue. To begin, we want to get our palette. This is a wet palette. Zoom in and put our Prussian blue down and apply a simple base coat to the cloak. This is probably the easiest part of this, but the other parts are pretty simple. I will go ahead and base coat this entire cloak, and then we can get off on to the next part. Having base coated the cloak in a Prussian blue, dark Prussian blue rather, we can now move on to the layering. This isn't quite dry, but you know, it will dry as I explain this. So we are going to build this up in stages. Our darkest shadow is going to be Prussian blue, and our dark Prussian blue, and our lightest shadow is our lightest area is going to be Prussian blue. You can see there's quite a contrast between the two. Please try and ignore the orange and blue over there. It's these two colours. So our first one is we're going to take 1 part Prussian blue, 2 parts and 3 parts. We're going to take 3 parts dark Prussian blue, and we're going to take 1 part Prussian blue. I'm going to mix them together like so to create a slightly lighter colour, and then we're going to layer that on. We will then create another one with 2 parts Prussian blue or dark Prussian blue to 2 parts Prussian blue. I'm not really a fan of mixing, but you know, should be alright. Was that enough? I think I might just add a little bit more. I think that's about right. And then our final one with 3 parts Prussian blue, like so, to only 1 part dark Prussian blue. I'm quite sure these mixes I don't think are quite accurate, completely accurate, but you get the idea. Yeah, I think that needs a bit more. Not quite right. The middle one looks too light. I'm going to add just a little bit more, just to make it a bit darker. There we are. Maybe just a spot more as well, just to blend it in nicely. There we are, as far as I can tell. Right, so we have 5 layers. This is the base coat and this is the highlight, and then we're going to layer between the 3. Now that my cloak is dry on my model, I can begin layering on the first mix, which is the darker mix, and avoiding only the deepest recesses. Then we will apply the other layers following the steps outlined in my how to layer video. Building from the deepest recesses to leaving this in the shadow, and etc, etc, building up the layers so that we get quite a subtle colour transition. You can already see that it is starting to get a slight colour transition to it. This is natural due to the fact that we are using a lighter colour. I would do red on this, but I think blue illustrates it quite nicely. Whereas red is, I've got my red colours are a bit too close together anyway. That's why I use them for layering, because it means I don't have to mix anything. There we are. There we are. We can now move on, once this is dried, onto the second colour and the third colour respectively. I will then show you the final highlight of Prussian blue. So, I have finished the mixes, applying the mixes to the model. I think it's looking alright. I think the last mix was a little bit too bright, but we can always fix that. We're now on to the final step, which is the highlight with pure Prussian blue. We're just going to apply this to the very applying edges to this model, mainly towards the upper edges, but anywhere that's going to catch light well. Such as the areas around here, the areas at the top here, 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 and like that. Then we're also going to apply a slight highlight to the model there, on the area where the light will be hitting. So that is pretty much, once it dries, that will be the finished effect. We can now move on to the third and final technique. This final technique is a very subtle one again, but this time, rather than using two colours and mixing them, we'll only be using one. For it, I'll be using Vallejo's Green Grey, but of course, after I have, I'm sort of using two because I will be base coating it and applying a wash. I'll get on with that and be back when we're ready to layer. With the wash now dry, we can continue with the layering, or we can begin layering. The first layer that we want to do will be covering everything apart from the deepest recesses where the wash has dried. It will be using the same colour we base coated with, which was Vallejo's Green Grey, I believe. Yeah, I think it was. Just going to mix it, 'cause it's separated a little, and go over the main areas. So I will paint it on all the areas, avoiding the deepest recesses. Well, I'll let this dry and then we can do the next step. With the previous layer now dry, we can move on to the next layer. For this layer, we are going to leave a small amount of the previous layer showing, but we are just going to paint over it, almost entirely, leaving just a bit of it to define the recesses and to give us a slow graduation in colour. This method essentially just builds up the layers of colour by making one of the colours more opaque. This leaves us a very nice graduation in colour if you didn't want to say something like dramatic layering or the layering technique I showed you in my previous video, where you're going to get a lot of very heavy colour transitions. Here it is far more subtle and can be far more controlled by how many layers you actually put on. Remember that this paint needs to be quite thin, so that it is slightly translucent, and that you can see the previous layer through it, up until a point where, if with enough layers, you have an opaque surface. Like, there we are. And there was. We will then continue this for the next layer, just slowly building up the colour. After the next layer is done, I will come back and show you the finished result. So here is the finished result. As you can see, it is very subtle. It would require possibly a final highlight just to bring out the extra contrast, and maybe a recess shade, for example putting a black wash in the deepest recesses just to strengthen the contrast. So anyway, that is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure you press that like button. It will help the channel, and it, best of all, costs you absolutely nothing. If you really enjoyed this and have enjoyed other videos in the past, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, it costs you nothing, but does really help the channel. We are hoping that at some point we'll be able to get to 100 subscribers and get a custom URL. That'll be good, because then you'll just be able to type in www.youtube.com/rebelrogue, and then that'll be really simple rather than the millions and millions of digits it's currently at. Anyway, thank you for watching, and goodbye.